Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. This episode is from our Protecting Animals series, where we talk to animal advocates past and present about the work they do for animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now, as always, this episode is brought to us by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA has their conference coming up in Adelaide very soon. It is on in July. Have a look on their Facebook page or their website to see who will be speaking. I'll be there and I'll be recording episodes of Knowing Animals there. So please think about joining ASA and also coming along to their conference. It'll be wonderful to see you there. Right, so this episode is coming to you from the beautiful Voiceless office, where I'm very lucky to be joined by Dave Simon. Dave is all the way from America. He's a lawyer, he's an animal advocate, and he's author of the books Meatonomics, is that how you're pronouncing it?
Right.
Meatonomics. So Dave is in Australia as part of the 2017 Voiceless Animal Law Lecture Series, a series that I think probably many listeners will be familiar with, and in fact some of you no doubt will see Dave or hear Dave speak during this tour. So welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you very much.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to write the book?
A few years ago, I read a law review article that said that because of a number of legislative changes, animals raised for food in the United States had essentially no legal rights, zero. And I certainly had not been aware of that previously. I knew that conditions on factory farms were bad. I just didn't realize that producers had sought to make those conditions completely legal.
So this was a revelation to you. Were you already engaged in animal protection at all at that time?
Yeah, I went vegan almost 10 years ago, and shortly after that, I started advocating for animals. So it was certainly on my radar, although the subtlety of the legal situation was not yet on my radar.
But you were already involved in legal practice?
Yes.
Yeah. So the book is, I think, quite a blend of legal and also economic arguments. Can you let the listeners know what the central claims are that you make in the book?
Sure. I make the argument that animal food producers have engaged in a three-pronged campaign to reach the hearts and minds of consumers in what are clearly unfair and often misleading ways. So the three elements of this campaign are legislation, messaging, and price control. And I go into pretty substantial discussion of each of those elements in the book. And for anyone who goes to my presentation, they will likely see me discuss those elements as well.
And so it's three aspects. Do you see one of those aspects as being more important than the other, or do they need to all work together in unison?
Well, I think the price control is probably the most important because there's dollars involved and people respond to price cues in predictable ways, although the other components are certainly important as well, and I think in many cases should cause some level of outrage, both for American and Australian consumers who are being subjected to these programs.
So how different do you see the situation in Australia and America? Have you had the chance to have a look into the subsidies regime, for example, in Australia?
There are some differences. I think that they're minor. I think that in general, the same programs are being pursued in Australia, although arguably not yet with quite the same level of aggression that we're seeing in the United States. But I do think that in principle, the ideas are the same in both countries.
So on one level, subsidizing animal agriculture seems counterintuitive because it's taxpayers' money. Why subsidize? What's the logic behind the subsidizing regime?
I think the original logic behind subsidizing animal foods was that there was a belief that these foods are an important part of people's diet, and we want to provide some level of protection to the farmers who are raising them. I think that we've come to learn recently that animal foods are not an important part of our diets, so we should certainly rethink that part of that premise.
And in terms of protecting the interests of farmers, what do you say in response to that element of the logic?
Well, I sort of get the idea that food is one of the most important goods that people buy. Without it, we'll die. And there are other things that, if you don't get it, you won't die. Like if you can't buy an iPhone, you're not going to die. If you can't get adequate calories in your diet, you might die. So I can understand the argument that we want to protect farmers to some extent. But I think that most of the research that's been done on subsidies, particularly in the animal food area, shows that they're just providing all of the wrong incentives. They're incentivizing farmers, particularly in America, where the subsidies are much higher than they are in Australia, incentivizing farmers to raise animals when otherwise doing so would be completely unprofitable. So we're paying subsidies of up several $100s per head of cattle, for example, to produce beef that is not profitable absent the subsidy.
And so the subsidies then presumably have a distorting impact on the market. Can you say something about what that distorting impact is?
Subsidies in the U.S. are, as I said, substantially higher than in Australia. And in the U.S., they probably affect demand by several percentage points. So we could say 2 to 3%, which is material. In Australia, the subsidies are actually quite a bit lower than in the U.S., which I think is one good thing we can say about the Australian market. Although certainly they would have some effect here as well, perhaps a percent, a 0.5%. There are other influences that I think are much more important than subsidies. Subsidies are certainly an easy target, and it's certainly something that we should look at eliminating, but there are other things that I think are causing people to buy meat and dairy with greater influence than subsidies.
Right, and what are those things?
Well, in Australia, you've got programs called levies. A levy is a tax that the federal government imposes, acting through the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. The Department of Agriculture imposes levies on over 100 commodities, and the majority of those are animal foods. And these levies the funds are collected and spent to promote animal foods. And I would guess that most Australians have seen or heard messages like, "You're better on beef," "Get some pork on your fork," "We love our lamb," and other catchy, quippy slogans like that. And all the evidence shows that those programs are very effective. They increase sales by 6% or more of those goods, which is a greater increase than I think subsidies are responsible for.
So, in your view, then, we are being led by advertising to consume animal protein in a way that is not only counterproductive to our own health needs, but we wouldn't otherwise do. Is that right?
I think that is accurate, yes. I think people are bombarded with these messages, and consciously or subconsciously we respond. It's not a new concept that people respond to advertising. And here, given the fact that it's actually the federal government which is backing industry and promoting these foods, I think the ads even have potentially a stronger impact.
So, some of our listeners might not be familiar with the legal framework around agricultural animals in America. Can you say something about how that operates?
So in the United States, in a big way, and in Australia to a slightly smaller extent, although Australia is catching up with us, animal food producers in the last 3 decades have been responsible for introducing legislation mostly at the state level, to some extent at the federal level, but at the state level, they've introduced over 170 new laws that are designed to decriminalize abuse of farm animals and to make it difficult or impossible for consumers to investigate, criticize, or sue producers. And this very aggressive and extensive framework of legal protection surrounds producers with a cocoon that literally insulates them from exposure and allows them to raise animals in what they believe to be the most cost-effective and least regulatory fashion.
And so do you see conditions or, say, the legal protections available to animals in America as decreasing?
I would say that there is a battle going on. And what we're seeing is that in some states, we might get a win, like Massachusetts recently adopted an animal welfare statute that provides that animals need to be given room to exercise and spread their wings. And yet at the same time, Arkansas just adopted an ag bill that criminalizes undercover investigations. So you get a win in one state and you get a loss in another state. The parties on both sides of the war are actively engaged, and obviously one hopes that the animal welfarists will prevail.
In some ways, are you amazed that the animal protection community does have any impact given the volume of wealth and the federal taxes and all the rest of it that are applied or that are at play in the animal production side of the kind of conflict, if we can call it that?
It's definitely an unfair battle, and if money were the only basis, if money were the only ammunition, then we'd have no hope of winning. I think it's lucky that money isn't the only form of ammunition, and in fact, images that come out from undercover investigations on factory farms routinely and consistently show just terrible abuse of animals raised in factory farms. I think it's those images and growing awareness worldwide, U.S., Australia, and other countries, that is allowing this battle to be fought on more of an equal playing field.
And so it's for that reason that we get the advent of ag-gag laws, presumably.
Yes, exactly. When a number of when disturbing images and video come out of a factory farm, inevitably we find that shortly thereafter, legislators in that state want to make it a crime to produce those images. And what's so shocking about that is it's a recognition on their part that, look, we've got a problem here, and we've got two choices. Either we can fix the problem, or we can just make it a crime for anybody to talk about the problem. So we'll just make it a crime to talk about the problem. It just seems like a ridiculous way to address a problem.
So, Dave, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure.
Can you recall when you first started to think that there was something wrong or problematic about the relationship between human and non-human animals?
I do. I was, living in Northern California. It was, let's say, early 1990s, and a mountain lion or a cougar had just been shot. The animal was sleeping in a tree, and law enforcement decided that it posed a risk, and they shot him or her. And I remember thinking at the time that this is an endangered animal in California. There were something like 4,000 of them, whereas there were something like 35 million humans in California. And to me, it just seemed that they had placed the emphasis on protection on the wrong species, and that perhaps it was the mountain lion that was entitled to protection and not the humans. And that was sort of the first time I remember thinking about the different way that we look at and treat animals.
Interesting. Can you recall the first thing you did to try to bring about change for animals?
Well, I think the first thing I did that had any impact was I went vegan in 2008, and immediately that resulted in saving the lives of something like 100 animals a year. The following year, I began to advocate aggressively for animals and hold signs and protests and engage in legal work to benefit animals and that thing. But I think really going vegan was the first major step in that direction.
If you had to name one animal advocate who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
That would be Ingrid Newkirk, the founder and president of PETA, because I went vegan shortly after watching a movie about her, which is called I Am an Animal. I watched the movie, and then it led me to go to the PETA website and look at some videos, and within hours I had made a decision to go vegan.
Interesting. So what's the most important thing animal advocates can do for animals?
I think that I think everybody has a different set of skills that they can bring to the table. You run a podcast, I do legal work, and I've written a book. Other people are great at PR or building websites or holding signs and pickets or giving talks. And I think everybody has a unique skill that they should find, and they should, to the greatest extent, and in the time that they have available, they should exercise their skill to help animals in the way that they can.
So, Dave, if you had the power to change one thing about the non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
My brain's working here. If I could change one thing about the human-non-human relationship, well, I would like to see humans no longer imprison, kill, and eat animals. And I think that would, for me, that would do it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Great. So, Dave, what are you working on next?
I'm a lawyer, and I've got a number of cases that I'm litigating on behalf of animals. They include, for example, I'm suing a foie gras factory farm in New York. I'm suing the Coast Guard over their program of shooting cormorants in Oregon, and I'm suing some, although perhaps I should be shooting them. I'm suing some religious practitioners who kill chickens as part of a religious ritual. So I'm gonna continue to litigate these cases, and perhaps I'll find some additional new ones to bring as well.
Right, so you're certainly busy. Where can people find out more about your work?
Well, my book, Meatonomics, is portrayed at meatonomics.com, just sort of as it sounds phonetically. And I'm also on the board of an organization called Animal Protection and Rescue League, aprl.org, and it's on behalf of that organization that these cases I've described are being litigated.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dave, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars and animal advocates about their work. Don't forget to review us on iTunes and also to subscribe. Reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.